This morning I spoke about those massive changes in military technology that had occurred from the end of the Civil War to the beginning of World War I, and then really the making of modern warfare between 1914 and 1918. In the middle of this mix, in April of 1917, we throw in the U.S. military. Now we've got a problem. Traditionally, the United States had viewed its Army as a sort of an ugly necessity. We had a long-standing fear of standing armies for good reason. One is they're detrimental to one's liberty if you're not careful. Most importantly, they're also detrimental to one's pocketbook. So when the war in Europe breaks out in August of 1914, the United States Army is ranked 17 in the world, behind Portugal and Romania. Now the good news was, on a good day, we could probably beat the hell out of Montenegro. Sadly, due to a host of reasons, generally associated with the American public's interest and some political shenanigans, we failed to take full advantage of learning from what the Europeans were doing prior to our entry in April of 1917. So when the war begins, that's our strength. That's the National Guard and the regular Army together. Right around 300,000 officers and men. That's a couple of bad weeks of wastage on the Western Front. Now, we got any Marines out here? I thought we had a few. Okay, good. I'd be ashamed to. Just saying. Okay, we got one. Thank you. The Marines start off with 13,000. In fact, if you were to ask the average American on the street prior to World War I, tell me about the Marine Corps, they'd look at you with a stunned look. It was not a part of the American consciousness. World War I makes the modern Marine Corps. In fact, there's an old Army argument that, you know, an average Marine Corps rifle squad has 4 photographers, 4 riflemen, and a public affairs officer. And that starts in World War I. They get a coup on the Army. Their first poster is "First to Fight," showing Marines landing on a beach. And that appeals to a certain group of young Americans. And so they tend to get some of the most avid recruits in the early days of the war. And it'll ultimately raise to a strength of 80,000. And so in that 19 months, there are actually more Marines that are raised for this war than the entirety of the Marine Corps up to that point combined. But this is not going to be an Army suitable to go overseas. President Woodrow Wilson decides early on that his major goal for the war is going to be the peace. And in order for the United States to gain a role in the peace process, he's going to have to raise a large expeditionary force, and those soldiers are going to have to bleed their way to the peace table. We do learn a few things based upon the experience of the British, who most closely represented or reflected our military experience. We learned how to not do things, how to not try to build an army based upon territorial forces and volunteers. So within a month and a half of the war starting, or re-entering the war, we decided that this army, for the first time in American history, will be built largely on conscription. And over 70% of the American soldiers of the war are draftees. So that's going to take care of the bulk. Because the Army War College determines in the summer of 1917, for the United States to actually accomplish the president's goals, that they're going to have to expand the officer corps to over 200,000 and the enlisted corps to over 4 million. It's going to set up some problems. We are woefully unprepared for this. We're unprepared for it with personnel, we're unprepared for it with weapons, we're unprepared for it with doctrine. And we're going to have to figure this out on the fly. First one is just simply a lack of equipment. The defense budgets were pretty scarce in these days, and it comes down to even the most basic of things. When the draftees start to show up in the late summer and early fall of 1917, we don't even have enough rifles to equip the soldiers. In fact, here in Atlanta at Camp Gordon, the commander resorts to going to all the local sawmills and having them cut out rifles so the soldiers will have something to drill with. The soldiers derisively call this the Fort Gordon or Camp Gordon 1917 Special Rifle. When it comes to the rifles themselves, Dave has them on display over here. Our primary rifle going into the war is the 1903 Springfield, one of the most beautiful weapons that the American infantryman was equipped with in its history. Problem is, it's so beautiful because it's mostly handmade. And it's only being made in one place, Springfield Arsenal in Springfield, Massachusetts. So when the War College goes to the Ordnance Department and says, hey, we're going to build a 4 million man army, their response is, that's nice, what are you going to arm them with? The German Chancellor Otto Bismarck once said, God has a special providence for drunks, small children, and the United States of America. We're actually fortunate because when the war breaks out, the British are considering changing to a new rifle, their pattern 14. The problem is when the war breaks out, they can't afford to shift their production to different lines, and so they come to the United States and start building the pattern 14 under contract at Remington and Winchester. And so when Springfield can't fulfill their obligations, the Army goes to Remington and Winchester and asks them if they can take that British rifle, rechamber it from the British .303 to American .30-06 and mass produce it. Fortunately, Bismarck is right. They can do that, but it's still going to be a while before the infantrymen get their basic tool, the rifle. In fact, one of the American divisions, the 4th Division, which is raised and trained at Camp Green, North Carolina, has one of its infantry regiment that do not receive their rifles until after they reach France. It's even worse for the machine gunners and the artillerymen. This is a picture of artillery training at a Camp Pike, Arkansas. I don't know if you can see it very well, but I'm not really sure how many Germans you can kill with a log mounted on some wagon wheels. You can do some basic artillery training, but the vast majority of American artillerists do not receive the French guns that they're going to use until after they get to France. Same thing for the machine gunners. Now, the training itself is going to be hindered by things that the Army can't control. The winter of 1917, 1918 is one of the coldest in the 20th century. And you have deep snows as far south as Georgia, here, and Florida. That's going to bring training to a halt for weeks on end. We've already discussed the influenza outbreak, which will again break training, but even little things like mumps and measles. The minute that any soldier in a unit gets mumps, the whole unit is quarantined, taken out to the woods and left for over a month until it passes out. And of course, in that month, they'll be lucky if they can do some close order drill, but not much else. In addition to that, the military itself is hurting its training. Just to give you an example, here at Camp Gordon, the 82nd Division is brought up to full strength by roughly late September, early October of 1917. But the mobilization of the U.S. Army is so chaotic that the War Department is figuring out which unit's going to deploy before which other unit, and will then quickly levy troops from one unit to shift it over to one that, in theory, is going to deploy earlier. An American infantry division in World War I is 28,000 men, twice the size of the French, German, and British units. And about the time the 82nd is reaching that 28,000 men number, orders come down from the War Department in early October that levies out every infantry enlisted man in the unit and takes the unit down to 783 men. Over the next few weeks, the division is slowly, painfully brought back up to strength by draftees from the Northeast. And here's the issue. This is happening across the American Army. The 86th Division will ultimately have 100,000 men passing in and out of its ranks. Now, if you're a sergeant or you're a lieutenant or a captain, this is going to devastate your training, because just as you start to get moving, start progressing in your training, half your unit leaves, raw recruits show up, and when you do that, you have to start at the lowest possible level. But here's the problem. You could do that in the American Civil War. It would be painful even then, but the technology was as such that you could quickly take guys, and with a little bit of rudimentary training, you could slap them in the lines. With all those technological developments that we discussed earlier in the morning, it's all coming home to roost with the American Army. In its heart, the American Army was a small constabulary force, and had spent the previous decade chasing Moros in the Philippines, not John Moros, but Filipino Moros, and banditos in Mexico. And its mindset and its doctrine and its technology was focused on those sort of small wars. But now they've been thrown into the deep end of the pool. And overnight they have to change their organization, their tactics, their doctrine, and their weaponry to survive on this new battlefield. And this just gives you an indication of how rapidly things are changing. Here is an American infantry regiment in 1916, sort of like we saw earlier with the French. 1916, before we go overseas, all the guys in the unit except for the officers are armed with rifles. You have a provisional machine gun company. Provisional in the Army means, we're really not sure we're going to give this to you or not. We're going to test it out. There's the same infantry regiment by 1918. Just to give you an idea of the magnitude of this change, of those new weapons at the bottom, only one of them had been invented prior to the war breaking out in 1914. It's even more devastating when it comes down to the basic levels of an infantry unit. It's squads and platoons. You've got the American Infantry Platoon on the left in April 1917. Pretty easy. Small group of sergeants, corporals, a platoon leader, and a small handful of men, all armed with rifles. I color-coded what the squad looks like by June of 1918. So every one of these colors, every one of those little divisions is a new specialty inside that platoon. Now this is going to be a problem. When you start to expand your officer corps from 8,000 to 200,000, the question is, where are you going to get your officers and where are you going to get your non-commissioned officers? Well, the Army solution to this is to establish a series of officer training camps across the United States. They're going to be 3 months long. And in 3 months, you're supposed to teach all these officers up to major rank, the rank of major, battalion commanders, all the intricacies of modern war. Now, that's a tall order as rapidly as things are changing, especially when the officers who are running the camp have no idea about the changes in modern war themselves. And the Army is deliberately stiff-arming the foreign officers that are coming over to help us. Matter of pride. Now, when these guys show up in the unit, and the idea is the minute that they graduate from the officer training camps, they go across the parade ground and take commands of platoons, companies, and battalions. When they arrive, the soldiers have a name for them. 90-day wonders. Okay? Now, that's not a good thing. It's not, oh, these guys are wonderful. It's, we wonder why the hell they ever got commissions. And it's not that these are bad guys. They tend to be pushed towards college students, college graduates, which are a small number of people in the United States in 1917, 1918. They want to be here. George McMurtry, who is over 40 years old, will accept a commission out of one of these officer training camps and will be awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions with the Lost Battalion in early October of 1918. He's a Wall Street millionaire, and yet he's showing up to go through officer training. So it's not that the people aren't willing to do stuff, but you don't know what you don't know. And oftentimes the guys who are training the subsequent camps are people who graduated from the previous camp. So we have a problem of the blind leading the blind. One officer admitted that his training consisted of nothing more than reenacting Civil War field problems through the mosquito-filled swamps of Arkansas. You take care of your officers by hook and crook, you've got even a harder time building a cadre of non-commissioned officers. As we've said, non-commissioned officers are the backbone of any military force. They're responsible for the individual training of the soldiers and the airmen and the sailors. They're also responsible for that basic level of discipline and leadership. You can send guys to a 30-day or a 30-month, 90-day training plan, but you don't have a plan for raising your cadre of NCOs. And so what often happens are the draftees that show up on Monday quickly become the sergeants for the draftees who show up on Wednesday. This is going to create some issues with training. And officers will frequently write in their letters and diaries that I stayed up all night to learn how to disassemble the 03 Springfield so I could give the class to my soldiers the next day. With all of those problems we discussed, the problems of nature, the problems of Army personnel policy, the problems of lack of equipment and poor leadership training, Pershing realizes that no two of the divisions that are showing up in the American Expeditionary Force in France have the same type of training, that every one of them are idiosyncratic. And oh, by the way, you're going against the pros from Dover. Guys have been fighting this for a long time. In 1861, the commander of what will become known as the Army of the Potomac, Irwin McDowell, is dragging his feet. And the president, Abraham Lincoln, is getting tired of it. And every time that Lincoln pushes McDowell to take charge on the battlefield, McDowell responds, "My soldiers aren't trained, they are not ready." And finally, Lincoln gets tired of this and says, "It is true, you are green, but they are green also. You are all green alike." These are the European armies of 1914, 15, 16. They were all green alike in 1914, but they get to learn a pace from each other. This American army is being thrown into the deep end of the pool. It's going to be the good high school football team that has a lot of raw talent and a very deep bench that's being sent to the Super Bowl against the Pittsburgh Steelers. Pershing realized he has to do something. He believes in the back of his mind that he's going to create the Army of 1919. That by 1919, we'll have the soldiers, we'll have the equipment, we'll have the training, we'll have all our bugs worked out, and we will actually be the only army in the field capable of winning the war. And to get there, he comes up with a standardized plan. If all the divisions are different, once they get to France, I'll fix it. 3-month training plan. First month, issue the soldiers the weapons they're going to fight with, finally, and give them individual training up to the company and battalion level. The second month, you will send them to a quiet sector of the Allied trenches. Well, they will learn trench warfare, but also become accustomed to war under actual conditions. The third month of training, you will take them out of the trenches and you will do large training of divisions and corps in open warfare. Because Pershing believes the only way you're going to win the war is to get out of the trenches and defeat the enemy in the open. Easier said than done. Now, it's a great idea. But the problem with warfare is always make sure your enemy understands what you want him to do. Woody Allen once said that if you want to make God laugh, tell him your plans. In fact, the strength of these burgeoning Americans is what actually pushes the Germans to act. The Generalissimo of the German forces, Erich Ludendorff, along with Paul von Hindenburg, realized that the Germans have a fleeting window. With the collapse of Russia in 1917, they have the hopes of finally stopping Germany's strategic dilemma of a two-front war. And so what Ludendorff figures out is that if I can take the troops from the east and use them decisively before these young green Americans can come in numbers to influence the war, I might actually be able to win this for Germany. And so starting in March of 1918, he launches a series of ultimately disastrous offensives to try to win the war. But in the midst of this crisis, this JV football team, the American Expeditionary Force, is being thrown into the deep end of the pool. And as you can expect, their losses are pretty high. Through the summer of 1918, we lose over 10,000 dead. And 4 times that number wounded in places like Belleau Woods, at Saint-Mihiel, and at the Anne-Marne. And as Robert McCormick, heir to the great Chicago Tribune family, would write, let's be honest, these soldiers were not really up to speed in understanding the war that had developed by this time of the conflict. Now, your friends will probably tell you when you have a problem, and they'll be honest. We know that these are honest because these were secret French accounts of liaison officers with the American Army that then reported back to their officials. I'd like to thank Bob Doty for pointing these out to me. The first one is a pretty blunt account of the 77th Division, shortly before it was going into combat in the Meuse-Argonne. The troops are very courageously led by officers with a total misunderstanding of war. But the French were also impressed by a couple other qualities of the American soldiers. As I discussed before, George McMurtry millionaire, decides he's going to show up. Teddy Roosevelt, who had been a big proponent and bellicose for pushing the Americans into war. When war came, he put his money where his mouth was. And all of his sons served in the military. One of them, Quentin Roosevelt, was shot down, didn't make it back home. But those willingness to sacrifice was mimicked across the Army. Not only the officers, but also in the non-commissioned officers and the soldiers. And the French were impressed by this, because increasingly in the Allied armies, this was becoming a very rare occurrence. Now, if your friends will be honest with you, your enemies will be equally honest with you. After the Battle of Saint-Mihiel, the AEF's first exposure to combat in September of 1918, this is what the Germans are saying. They'll repeatedly say, these Americans are very brave, foolhardishly so. But you can tell that they have no conception of modern war. All you have to do is fire some machine guns and artillery at them. It'll disrupt their attack. They will go to ground, and then you can bring in more artillery to disrupt what they're doing. Problem is now, this army of 1919 thrown into the deep end of the pool in 1918 is then going to be committed to the Meuse-Argonne. And let's be honest, in World War I, even if you've got everything working for you, even if all of your cylinders are hitting, this is going to be a tough war. I love this quote, one of my favorites, from a machine gun officer in the 2nd Division. He says, this is just the reality of war. The Germans are masters at defensive warfare. They know how to do interlocking machine gun fire, and so if you try to flank to take out one machine gun, what inevitably happens is it's just taking you into the path of another one. When that's what you're faced with, you just keep moving forward. And so the infantry platoon that starts with 30 soldiers at the beginning of the attack to take out a machine gun ends with 8 men standing at the end. But at the end, those 8 men continue to move forward. But in the Meuse-Argonne, which is still the nation's biggest and bloodiest war in our history, all the chickens come home to roost. All of the problems with our mobilization, all of the problems with our training, all come down here. Now, John J. Pershing had a very optimistic plan for this operation. On the first day, the Americans would break through and push 16 kilometers into the German lines. The next day, they would get up and do it again, push 16 more kilometers, break through the vaunted Hindenburg line. And from then, it'd be a relatively easy march to the objective, the railhead at Sedan. But when the attack breaks out on the 26th of September, it doesn't go as anybody anticipated. The Germans had been in this location since 1914. In fact, the division in the Argonne Forest, the 2nd Landwehr Division, had been in that same forest since 1914 and had built some of the most incredible defenses on the Western Front. So you had formidable terrain, good defenses, a determined enemy, untrained American soldiers. The results you can see on the right. I just highlighted the first 3 weeks of this offensive because that's the bloodiest 3 weeks in American history. The Americans lose more men in the first 3 weeks than Grant and Lee's combined armies did in the 3 months of the Overland Campaign of 1864. And just to highlight you the difference, they lose more men, or nearly as many men, in the first week of Meuse-Argonne as we have lost in the last 17 years fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan. Some of the problems begin to appear. Some of the divisions, like the 35th Division and the 79th Division, quickly cracked under the strain. We find out that our general officers, in a lot of cases, are not prepared for modern war. As the casualties start to mount, cohesion starts to break down. Fred Takes, an infantryman in the 82nd Division, said that his company went into combat with 250 men. 8 days later, they were reduced to 3 5-man squads. We talked earlier about the importance of logistics. You're not well served by geography here. Each of these 100,000-man corps only is supported by one major road in each of them. And those roads quickly become clogged. In fact, Georges Clemenceau, the Premier of France, will visit the American front on the 28th of September to see how Pershing was doing. He gets stopped in one of these traffic jams, gets irritated after waiting a couple hours, stomps a mile forward, gets back in his car, goes back to Paris, and then tells Ferdinand Foch that he wants Pershing relieved of command. Fortunately, Foch had a stronger head and knew that was never going to happen. But you can see the dire problem here. In fact, shells aren't getting forward, and if shells aren't getting forward, the infantry's not moving forward, food's not getting forward, and casualties aren't getting back. In the 79th Division, it was taking 18 hours for the ambulances to go back 5 kilometers to the field hospital. There's no golden hour for the doughboys. As the soldiers start to move forward, the AEF is presented with an unsolvable problem. Again, this is supposed to be the Army of 1919, and the Army had not figured out how they were going to do combat replacements. So in the summer of 1918, our replacement system completely breaks down. And one of the greatest tragedies in American military history, we started to take men with no training, put them on board ships, send them to France. So a guy who had been in a uniform for less than a month, less than a week, on board ship, lands in France, and within a month and a half of being in uniform, he's in combat. The officers and sergeants report that a lot of these men, they had to train them how to load their rifles before they were going over the top. The 77th Division reported that 80% of the replacements that they received had never fired a rifle or thrown a grenade in their military service. By the second week of the Meuse-Argonne, early October 1918, the AEF was at the point of collapse. Hunter Liggett, who commanded the 1st Corps and would then later take on the 1st Army, reported that there were 100,000 American stragglers behind the lines. 100,000 American soldiers who had absented themselves from the fighting position. Now, this was caused by a couple of things. One is 250-man infantry companies with untrained officers and NCOs were just hard to control, especially going through that tangled terrain of the Meuse-Argonne. Some men simply get lost. Other men, after having not eaten for 3 days, leave the front lines, find the first field, kitchen that they can, eat, and then telecommute back to the battle. But some of these men, a lot of them being these untrained replacements, realize that discretion is the better part of valor and try to duck combat. In one instance, a cavalry patrol finds over 100 soldiers in an old German dugout behind the line. Fortunately, after all this pain, the American Army starts to learn. And one of the things we learn is to take pages from the French book. The French had already figured out that it's impossible to do these 16-kilometer advances against an unbroken enemy. So the Americans start to figure out exactly what the French were doing. Limit your attack to what can easily be supported by your artillery. Grab a little, bring up your artillery, rinse and repeat. 2 guys that figured this out are Hunter Liggett and Summerall of the 5th Corps. Now, Hunter Liggett is a fascinating guy. He is well north of 270 pounds. He's a large man. In fact, he's so large that Pershing's not sure that he would be fit for command in the AEF. And just before he's supposed to dismiss him, Liggett turns to him and says, "General, the one thing you need to understand about me is my fat stops at my neck." No truer words could be spoken. I will tell you, in my estimation, Hunter Liggett is the greatest American general of the war. He's the guy who starts to understand the ugly realities of modern war, and that men, unsupported by firepower, are going to make no headway against this. Summerall is going to be his agent. And after going into an operational pause for nearly 2 weeks to try to untangle all of those supply problems and bring up the shells, on the 1st of November, the American Army starts to get it right. A 2-division attack with 2 experienced divisions, the 2nd Division and the 89th Division. But they're not going to go forward until the artillery and the firepower makes its day. Over 1,500 guns on an 8-kilometer front. That's pretty tight. That's 1 gun per 20 meters of the front. They've stockpiled the ammunition by fixing the supply issues. Love out to the loggies. Okay? They're going to, for the first time, have a massive use of gas. And we're going to concentrate the gas, learning from the Germans, that you don't necessarily drop it on the frontline troops. You drop it on the command post, and you drop it on their artillery to confuse them, to get them in spot. We're also going to turn to the air service. Now, I can't say that I don't love Billy Mitchell, but Billy Mitchell sometimes stretches the truth. Billy Mitchell had been irritating the doughboys, the infantry doughboys, throughout this campaign by his operations going deep. When the American doughboys kept complaining that when you go deep, there's nobody keeping the Germans off our heads. So Liggett turns to Mitchell and says, guess what, Slick? All your operations will be focused on supporting the ground advance. Last but not least, when this attack begins, Summerall orders every machine gun in the Corps to fire 600 rounds of ammunition on targets behind the German lines. And his argument is, when we do that, that we will have a piece of shrapnel, a piece of artillery, or a bullet falling on every inch of the battlefield for a depth of 1,200 meters. It works brilliantly. And in the single first day, the 2nd Division makes an advance of nearly 9 kilometers. The 89th Division is not far behind. They go just under 7 kilometers. Now the German army is broken up, and the Americans now begin their victorious march to the Moose River at Sedan. Now this is a pretty sad indictment of the American army in World War I. And there's a couple of different people that come out and talk about this. On one hand, you've got the British and sometimes the French that say, the Americans, not that much. Then you've got Americans that go, we won the war. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. I would argue the Americans win the war just by showing up. Now, we're going to do some audience participation here because I love this picture, if you can see it. This is a German propaganda photograph of the first American soldiers captured by the German army. You've got the Americans here, you've got the German captors, and the little German stormtrooper that took them in the far left. Far right, you're right. Notice anything? What's that?
Big guys.
Yeah! The Americans are about a head taller than the Germans. Notice anything else? Yeah, they've got these long, luxurious greatcoats. By this time, all of the other powers are cutting their greatcoats to about the knees to save wool. So they are well uniformed, they are tall. Notice anything else? They are healthy.
They're also younger.
Say it loud and proud, my brother.
They're also younger men instead of the older German soldiers.
The Germans intend this to be a propaganda coup. They mass produce this picture, they send it around through Germany, and the idea is, don't worry about these Americans. Don't worry about these Americans. Look what we can do. The German public doesn't take that tack. The German public looks at this and goes, we are truly deeply screwed. And they start asking themselves questions. Where are our guys that look like this? And the answer is, they're dead. The Americans show up, and by showing up, they help to win. By showing up, they force the Germans to do strategically stupid things, like the Ludendorff offensives. They show up at the absolute nadir of the Allied war effort. 1917 is the worst year for the Allies. It's the year of the Russian Revolution. It's the year of Passchendaele. It's the year of the French mutinies. It's the year of Caporetto. The Americans are the only bright light. At the end, George Clemenceau will get it right. Victory will go to the side that can believe for just 15 minutes longer than the other side that they can win. Thank you.
Another audience participation. My esteemed colleague used the term golden hour. While they're bringing this up, how many of you know what the golden hour means? That's what I thought. Not very many hands. So in modern battlefields, if you can get a wounded soldier to a field hospital within an hour, and I might brag that in Afghanistan these were all Air Force hospitals. But if you can get a wounded soldier to a hospital within an hour and the soldier knows he's in, or she knows that they're in a hospital, they're going to survive. During these wars, those numbers were completely flipped. And so the remark, there's no golden hour during this age, was the point of, we lost so many that today we saved them all, which is also a problem for us. The vast majority of our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines come home now. And some of them have tragic, life-changing wounds that they'll now live with for 40 or 50 years. And the question for you and I is our society prepared to take care of our wounded for 40 or 50 years? Where in the past, wars have only tested us with small numbers and they didn't survive for long. So I leave you with that that was just a commentary on a couple of notes from the last piece. So thank you for allowing me to be here today. I want to tell you right up front that when you're a young man or a woman being trained to be an officer in today's military, some of the things you learn in the first part of your education is how to speak and how to sort of organize a presentation. And one of the first things you learn is do not rob yourself of your bravado or your expertise in the first words of your presentation. And I'm here to do that right now. I'm here to tell you I am not a historian. Let me say that now a second time. I am not a historian. So today what I'm really here to do is to talk to you as a practitioner. As the commander of NATO, I commanded a 28-nation alliance. As the military commander for 3 years in Afghanistan, I commanded a 40-plus nation coalition. And so what I think I am prepared to talk a little bit today is about the alliance, the coalition, and how this all worked during this war. It is a privilege to be here today. I got to tell you that that what we are doing, no matter how critical it sounds what we're saying, we are thinking about and protecting the investment and the legacy of a lot of soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines who died in this incredible war. And by remembering the challenges that they faced, then we can better prepare our nation so that the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines of the future don't need to make the same mistakes or have to suffer in the same consequences. I really thank you, and Cy, thank you for inviting me. You knew I wasn't a historian, and you gave me a shot anyway. But I thank you. I'm honored and humbled to be here to talk today a little bit about this great war. This war was the subject of many books, many talks, many papers. And suffice to say that we entered this war after our European coalition partners had made severe sacrifice and had come to see many, as you heard, of their young soldiers dead. And so while our import is important, while our involvement is important, as you have just heard said, it was late and it came at, I think, a very crucial moment, and I couldn't agree more with kind of what was said at the end. Just by showing up, we made a hell of a difference. And he described it wonderfully with that picture, but I saw it in many of the words that I read, that when Germany saw what could and was beginning to come from America, it was a huge turning point in their decision about how to try to get out of this war. Our sacrifices didn't go unnoticed. So I want to use a few slides here and hit a few high points. The great and good news is that I'm going to be very quick because most of my points really have already been made. The coalition that we joined was a process. The legacy of that coalition, I would argue, is NATO today. And what I learned more than anything else preparing for the lectures I gave in France 2 weeks ago about U.S. Air Force aviator Frank Luke Jr., the lessons that I learned in preparing for today is that we are relearning and reliving things in World War II and beyond that we didn't get right in the way that this war ended. So, you've seen this picture before. In fact, it was on one of the previous slides. John J. Blackjack Pershing stepping off. Why do I show it to you? When he stepped off that boat, it was 2 months into our involvement into the war. And you might think in the day of aviation and things, that's crazy that the commander is there 2 months after our involvement in the war. Frankly, we're not in much better position today. During the Cold War, our fleet of ships and aircraft that we had to move our military forces to Europe was almost 10 times what we have today. Our Civil Reserve Air Fleet, our in-service naval assets, and our aircraft to move our capabilities to Europe if we had to fight today. 2 months is not a bad number, frankly, if we had to do it. The other thing that I think is illustrative about when he stepped off of that boat, and the historians are going to grade my paper if I get it wrong, but he had about 50 officers and about 100 enlisted men that constituted his headquarters. Our headquarters today are thousands. We have more people than that in just a small part of the intelligence function of a large headquarters today. So maybe one would say we're a little fat. Others, I think, would echo what you've been told today, which is we were unprepared to command and control this war. We really didn't know how to command and control this war. And so when he stepped off, he had a staff that was not ready to lead. The world had already been at war for about 3 years, and I would argue, these are my words, not a historian's words, but when he stepped off of that ship, we were fighting a coordinated war. We were a coalition that coordinated with each other. There was not a command and control capability, nor a command and control focus in the sense that we understand it today. This is the most important message I guess I'll leave you with today. As I told you before, I commanded an alliance, the NATO alliance, for 3 years. I also commanded the coalition in Afghanistan, and one is not equal to the other. In large terms, imprecise terms, in an alliance, there are rather loose, but we would hope not to be too loose, expectations of each other in an alliance. I'll use the NATO alliance as an example. Article 5, people think of it as the collective defense article, whereby if one is attacked, we're all attacked, and we are required to come to the aid of each other in alliance. So there are some burdens one takes on themselves when they go into an alliance. Now let me tell you that that's not pure. There's still a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes to make sure that everybody is stepping up to the task in alliance. Does anybody know when the NATO alliance invoked Article 5 only one time? Not the military guys, you can't answer it. Who else? Anybody?
Afghanistan.
Yeah, after 9/11, going into Afghanistan, NATO invoked Article 5 to defend the United States. So in NATO, the only time collective defense has been used is to defend the United States, not vice versa, which is what you hear so much worry about in the news and the press. On the coalition side, it's very, very different. In a coalition, we are a coalition of the willing, is the way I like to describe it. And every time as the coalition ISAF superior commander in Afghanistan, I would talk to our 4-star in Afghanistan. We'd say, we want to do this, that, and the other. The tactical commander would come to me, go help me. And that meant for me to go to the capitals of these nations and convince them that what we were about to do was important and they needed to be a part of it. So in an alliance, you have to build willingness to be a part of the fight to do what you do. And some armies come to your alliance with caveats. We won't fight outside the wire, we'll run business inside the wire. Some alliances, some come to the alliance and say, we'll do anything asked of us, and then you move out. But alliances are very different. A coalition pools its and coordinates its resources and use them in a unified effort. Whereas in an alliance, there is a relationship that is generally based on command and control. And notice I hedged my bet there. with the general we were. I'm not going to talk about this anymore because you have had magnificent speakers talk to you about how we ended up in this coalition. So let me just hit a couple of high points. We were late to the fight, and you'll hear me say more than once now, we were not ready for the fight we arrived to. So, why would I put this picture up here? I don't intend to talk to you about these. The historians will tell you these personalities are amazing. Each one of them had some weird sort of background about how they came to where they came to be. A really dynamic bunch. Foch, a resurrected career, really was kind of on his way out. Pétain, the savior of the French army, probably the best, as you heard earlier, the best they had. Haig, self-serving, doctored his own diary to tell a story after the war. Pershing, ambitious, dedicated, but absolutely inexperienced in industrial war. Clemenceau, energetic, that's one word used. Other people called him volatile. Traditional French approach. The Prime Minister, Lloyd George, distrustful of his military. Can you imagine leading a country's military and distrusting the leadership immediately below you completely? Wilson, you describing how you want to describe him. I wouldn't want to step on the toes of our Georgian historians, but most people saw him as an international novelist, idealistic. But the good news for a military person was he was relatively hands-off with the military, and he tried to allow military leaders to do what military leaders needed to do. So why do I even bring this up? When you are the commander, and we really didn't have one, but when you're trying to lead a coalition, you can't just step onto this stage and start ordering people to do things. Foch tried to do that a couple of times, and he quickly found out that his commanders were going back to their capitals and saying, I'm not so sure, we don't really want to do this, etc., etc. And so these personalities then have to be brought together in a willingness to move forward in a coordinated manner to really make this coalition win. And in the end, they do that. It's a delicate dance that they have to do, but in the end, they do that. Foch was given actually a handwritten letter in 1918, and he was named the General-in-Chief. But listen to these words, and the Army folks in our crowd will tell you they don't like these words. He was given coordination authority. Does that sound like command to you? No. He was given control over reinforcements. That was a lot of power. He could try to influence those people he was trying to direct by how he did that. But he was only given coordination authority. And then in his exact letter, I'll read this line, which I thought was absolutely death. I can't believe they actually wrote it in a letter. It would never survive today. It says, each commander-in-chief will have the right to appeal to his government if in his opinion his army is being placed in danger by the instructions given by General Foch. That's no way to run a railroad, in my humble opinion. So, we have talked a lot today about all the hurdles that this fighting force had to work its way through. I just want to hit them as sort of a wrap-up because every one of your previous excellent speakers have brought these up. Lack of training. We raised nearly 4 million men in this process. Now, not all of them got there, but we raised nearly 4 million. And there was almost no infrastructure to train them. You heard about how we created camps. You saw fake artillery pieces, which were a log on wheels to train artillery. We did do training once we got there, but as you also heard, that training was not for the duration nor the veracity that was intended. And so we had young men getting into the trenches and going over the top, as you heard, who had never fired their weapon or had never thrown a grenade. We talked a little bit about the small staff that General Pershing brought forward. The U.S. military had what was described then as a skeleton staff. And it was absolutely unprepared for or really untrained in the kind of war that we were to join. I didn't hear it said today, but in my reading it actually said that we had generals who were hoping to arrive and still do what we would call maneuver warfare with the cavalry. And what we landed to was a completely static war that was not what we had trained for. We had no one ready to deal with the size of the AEF. No one had thought about warfare at the size level, and soon we'll talk in a moment about logistics of the AEF. This is a point that scares me today. For the past 20 years, our military, and you can hear them talk about it in their testimony, the 4 service chiefs, our military has been fighting a counterinsurgency battle from fixed bases overseas. We like to call ourselves expeditionary because we go overseas to fight. But in actuality, we're fighting a counterinsurgency battle from fixed bases. Counterinsurgency means that we bring incredibly capable, incredibly precise, incredibly lethal fires together to support very small teams in small engagements. We haven't fought at the battalion level, we haven't fought at the brigade level, we haven't surely fought at either the divisional or corps level in over 4 decades. And I said fought, or even trained, since the last reforger was the last time that our nation deployed and exercised at divisional and up levels. And so I would argue, though, that we are a bit critical of this force as it arrived in theater and it wasn't ready to fight, when in fact we are in the exact same place now. If you listen to General Milley, the Chief of Staff of the Army, he talks all the time about having to get people's eyes off of their feet onto the horizon and thinking divisional and corps level battle. And how do we do that, and how do we support that? You heard us talk about unfamiliar equipment. You can't say it more than, I haven't shot my weapon until I go over and I have to shoot it at the enemy. We weren't there. We weren't producing our own cannons, you heard, and we had to use French cannon. We weren't producing at the rate and type of aircraft that we needed, so we primarily flew French aircraft. As I said before, and has been emphasized, we lacked a unified command structure. In fact, frankly, we just lacked a command. We had a coalition of the willing who participated when willing. We entered a mature theater of war. Again, those around us had learned from 3 years of battle, and we had to adapt. And here's probably the most critical line I heard, and this should damage us all, and this should cause us introspection. And that is that the U.S. offered little in terms of innovative thought when they first took the battlefield. Little in terms of innovative thought. I think we were reeling from not being able to fight the battle that we thought we were going to fight. We're on our heels in the way that we adjusted and looked at what we were going to do. And so it took us a while, but the good news is, as you heard in the previous speaker's talk, we've begun to get it later in the war. But initially, we were criticized for having little innovative thought. I'm not going to cover much more about race. It was frankly embarrassing what our nation did in this war, and much more embarrassing was we made progress during this war in race relations. It wasn't perfect, but we made progress. And then right after the war, we backed up. I take a lot of pride now. We're not perfect today, but in our militaries, we have come a long way to race and gender inclusion and getting better at getting race and gender promoted to the senior ranks. And I take a lot of pride in it. And frankly, when asked to do this research and reading about World War I was a bit I was a bit put off by what I found, and it's just sad. I'll skip the rest of my remarks on race. We were a divided United States in more than race. Huge divisions inside our country about whether we should be fighting the war or not. People actually, I've not heard it say today, but many describing this as Wilson's War. Wilson's War. And so, much like we see some senior politics these days, tagging it to a person when you don't like it. We were in a foreign theater. We had never really thought about fighting in a foreign culture. And frankly, other than those that you heard about, the approximately 20% who were from foreign lands, we really didn't have any language experience or have much understanding of what was going on in Europe. We did face an experienced and hardened enemy who might be reaching that point of no return, but at the point of our arrival, as you heard described, they were dang good at what they did, and they chewed us up pretty hard on the battlefield. Already talked about disease. I learned something last night. I thought that by the end of the war we had just had more lost to enemy action than disease, but in fact that's not the case. When the war ended, we still had lost more men and women to disease than we lost to combat. Think about that. And then finally, just one more time to emphasize, there was a lack of critical thinking and a lack of elasticity in the minds of the higher ranks. So with all this negativism, what happened? In the end game, as you heard described, we began to learn. The AEF began to fight smarter on the battlefield. We finally began to figure out, to a certain degree, we were never good at it, but we finally figured out how to begin to be better at logistics and moving capability to the front. You heard how incredibly important it was to bring coordinated, dense artillery fire. Well, that took shells, among other things, and it took shells being there at the appropriate time, not days or hours late for the firing. And so we got better at this. And in the end, we got better at a coalition than our opponents did. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. Now I step out on really thin ice. As a non-historian, I would make the following assertions. In our coalition, we happen to have a team that had mutually beneficial sort of expertise. Britain, a great sea power, and helped us in a great way at sea. Clearly, their fielded forces also helped. But think about having the British Navy and what it did to the Germans. France, a hardened land power, truly blunting the German thrust in time to allow the rest of the war to catch up and America to enter. And then finally, the United States, and these are my words and maybe they don't match your thoughts, but we were money and resources. And we showed up at the right time where our money and our resources, meaning our men and the things they brought with them, again, having probably less effect on the battlefield, but having more effect in the leadership of the German, the minds of the German leadership as to we are in a bad place, as you heard said before. In the German alliance or in their coalition, I would say what hurt them in my mind is that what hurt us a bit as a coalition on our side is that we occasionally argued about what we did. But in the end, that sharpened our battlefield actions. In fact, it was said of Pershing that a lot of his harebrained ideas were smoothed over by coalition conversation. But the bottom line is we found a positive way forward through the synergy of multiple leaders being involved. And in Germany, it was not that case. It was an autocratic action, and therefore sometimes autocratic ideas that were not widened by the eyes of lesser commanders got them in trouble. So, in the Allied coalition, we had an environment where there was a debate of ideas. when and how to attack, etc. In the Central Powers, it was Ludendorff, as you heard, and what Ludendorff had for the plan. The German economy at this time was primarily driven by the military, and that had a deleterious effect, I believe, as well. So, we won. Here's my bottom lines before I get to my closing remarks. I think we won because in the end, we figured out how to fight. We figured out how to fight better as a coalition, even though we had no command. We messed up logistics for a long time. We never got good at it, but we got better at it towards the end of the war. The combination of the influx of new soldiers from America, logistics getting better, and the coalition learning to fight better brought this war really to an end. The Central Powers, in the end, in my opinion, not a historian, were a coalition in name only, and they were failing because they lacked the strength of what a coalition brings. Our coalition won the war for all its faults because it generated more effective combat power and had a deep bench, as you heard the word used today, behind it. And our opponents were running pretty dry. So, now I just offer you my personal ideas. The first thing that came to mind to me in this study was we were not ready. And I offer to you right now that we are not ready to fight this kind of war today. If we had to face an opponent like Ukraine had to face when the Russians went into Donbass and invaded Donetsk and Lugansk, we're not ready. We're not ready to do that. We haven't fought at that level for a long time. We don't know how to move a force that far forward at any speed, and we don't understand right now how to project intelligence forward. So they were not ready, and I think we need to do self-introspection now. We were not ready in several ways. We have to applaud our Navy. We have some Navy cadets back here. They were probably the closest to being apace of the threat and the tactics of the time. We were not ready in our aviation forces. You've heard about how we had to rely on the French. We had to not embrace tank warfare. And it just kills me to think that we really wanted to be a maneuver force, and we had overlooked some of the tools that could have helped us to maneuver, but we weren't there. And we were absolutely reliant on French artillery. Why in the world is that? America could crank out artillery like nobody's business if we had decided to do it and taken the decisions and spun up our industry. Our Army was not ready for a lot of reasons you talked about. They had really just sort of not done well chasing down Pancho Villa, and you heard all of the descriptions in the previous conversation about how we were or were not training our leaders. If I was the SACEUR of this war, and I saw America coming to me the way America did, I would be really glad America was coming. But I would be really hard-pressed to figure out how to roll them best into my war because of the way that they arrived. So now, I think I'm sort of the last speaker before we go to a wrap-up panel of questions and answers. We cannot finish this on a down moment. We just absolutely cannot. I refuse to do that. So I want to take about 4 more minutes of your time and just give you 2 vignettes about what was incredibly right about our forces. This is from a letter. Horror gripped the heart of the World War I soldier as he saw his lifelong friend fall in battle. Caught in a trench with continuous gunfire whizzing over his head, the soldier asked his lieutenant if he might go back into the no man's land between the trenches to bring his fallen comrade back. "You can go," said the lieutenant, "but I don't think it'll be worth it. Your friend is probably dead and you may throw your own life away." The lieutenant's advice didn't matter, and the soldier went anyway. Miraculously, he managed to reach his friend, hoist him onto his shoulder, and bring him back to their company's trench. The officer checked the wounded soldier and looked kindly at his friend. I told you it wouldn't be worth it. Your friend is dead, and now you're mortally wounded. It was worth it, sir, said the soldier. What do you mean, worth it? Responded the lieutenant. Your friend is dead. Yes, sir, replied the private, but it was worth it because when I got to him, he was still alive, and I had the satisfaction of hearing him say, Jim, I knew you'd come. What happened in this war, God, I'm going to get choked up here, it's killing me. What happened in this war is brave young men and some women did horrible jobs in horrible conditions, and sometimes led horribly. They performed magnificent. One of the remarks that you saw on the previous slide is actually better than mine, but suffice it to say that German soldiers, after having mowed down in the assaults all the Americans stuck in the barbed wire, marveled at their bravery and tenacity. The determination bore fruit, as in the end the Germans began to realize they couldn't stand. Now to something I'm a little more attuned to. In the air, even though we started in a bad place, we weren't trained, we had no airplanes. We were far beyond our opponents, and we were flying European aircraft. Our aviators were keen, and they learned quick. They were well led. Now, some of their leaders were pretty brash and bravado and exaggerated. I think Rickenbacker, Billy Mitchell, some of these guys, they could tell a pretty good story, but when they're in their airplane, they could fly a pretty good airplane too. And they weren't afraid to lead our soldiers, because they were soldiers then, remember, in the air. They pushed the envelope. They made a lot of people mad, but they pushed the envelope. But they were visionary. Remember the description of our other leadership. In the air, our leaders were visionary. And they saw that aviation could make a difference. Maybe not in this war a huge difference, as was said earlier, but certainly a difference. I just want to bring up the story of one of those. As a young brigadier, I was privileged to lead Luke Air Force Base, named after Frank Luke, the Arizona balloon buster. The first airman, Army Air Corpsman, but airman, to be awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. He was an extremely hard young man to command. He was absolutely insolent in some of the things that he did. If he did something bad, he would land at a French field until he could take off and do something good, and then we'd go back home because he knew they wouldn't chew him out. That's how this young man thought. But let me tell you what was important about him. He loved fiercely. He loved his family, and he loved his brother aviators. He was a tough man to lead. His military discipline was horrible. He would fly out of formation and do things that he was forbidden to do, but that in the end is what made him America's leading ace. So how do you lead this kind of person? He had great leadership, though, and I won't go into those stories. He was driven to succeed, and what I think made him more important to others is what was brought up earlier about aviation in World War I was exactly true. The ability to spot and direct artillery was a huge thing for our aviators. And for the Germans, they would use balloons to do this. We did it as well, but the Germans would use balloons to spot and adjust troop movements and fire. And those balloons were so important to what was going on the front, they would ring them with massive defenses. Flak, machine guns, everything. They would sometimes put a circus overhead to protect the balloons. And especially when Frank Luke started popping these balloons and sending them to the ground, they started making it more and more and more tough for him to do it, until finally he was killed attacking balloons. But Frank Luke scored 14 of his kills against balloons, which everybody else thought was crazy. In fact, a few aviators were told to go attack a balloon, and they did something else because it was so dangerous to attack balloons. And Frank Luke went in there after him anyway, and we have at Mouzalgon, we celebrated his 100th anniversary of the shoot down in the town of Mervaux, and the French there in that town love him like he was their straight up blood. They buried him in their local church for 2 years, and then at the request of the Luke family, he was moved to the Mouzalgon to be in that huge cemetery with 14,000 plus of his brothers and sisters. So the way to end today, or my portion of this, is to say, man, as a military, we made some mistakes. Are we sure we're over those mistakes today? Are we ready to fight today like we might have to if we faced the Russia of the Ukraine attack? I don't think so. But what stood then still stands today. Our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines are the best in the world, period, paragraph. They made it work in World War I, and I think if we had to call on them again today, they'd make it work today. Thank you.